Hi, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. We're recording again on Monday morning in Jerusalem. Last night, President Yitzhak Herzog of Israel gave a primetime address where he begged the left and the right to get together and try to reach a compromise on judicial reform and to suspend the legislative process in the Knesset until they begin sitting down and deliberating and try to reach an agreement about how best to curtail judicial power in Israel, which right now is limitless. And we have extraordinary activists who have politicized everything in Israel through the court system and the legal fraternity. He was really speaking from the heart. I could tell watching him that as far as he was concerned, this was the biggest speech he's ever given in his life, and maybe the biggest one ever, and it was a big gamble. And the people in the government, Justice Minister Yariv Levin, and other members of the cabinet, but Levin is the most important person because he's the one pushing these reforms. He said, look, we're willing to have a dialogue. We're willing to sit down and think about how to compromise, but we're not going to stop the legislative process first. And this morning, the Knesset Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee passed the bills of the four bills of the judicial reform through the committee, and they're supposed to go to the plenary for an initial vote, or the first reading out of three to pass into law. And the idea is that it'll pass the first reading in the plenary, and then they can start discussing things. And so that was the government's response was, look, we want to compromise. We're not going to put the legislative process on hold. We're going to go forward with the first reading. But after we go through the first reading, we'll be happy to sit down and try to reach a compromise with the left. And you could say that means that they rejected his offer because he wanted them to suspend it completely, but it really wasn't a rejection. It was saying, look, we're not making constitution, we're not transforming Israel from a constitutional perspective. We're curtailing a constitutional coup that we've been suffering from for the past 30 years from the Supreme Court. And after that, we'll be willing to talk. The left's response, on the other hand, to Herzog's speech and call and really plea for compromise was completely different. Aside from former Defense Minister Benny Gantz, the left went nuts. They started attacking Herzog as the lapdog of the right and rejecting any form of compromise. We have now, a very large crowd of leftists outside of the Knesset. You had MKs from Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party that fomented a ruckus. They were banging on the table, sitting on the floor, screaming during the Knesset and Law and Justice Committee's hearings and vote on the judicial reform, and really acting like goons. They're acting like thugs. The Secret Service had to give more bodyguards to the chairman of the committee, Simcha Rotman, who's actually now he has a bodyguard actually guarding him inside of the committee because of the chaos going on inside of the Knesset. And then you have, several thousand, score thousand people outside of the Knesset who are on a Wildcat Strike. They left their offices and came to the Knesset to demand the end of the reform process. The mayor of Tel Aviv, former brigadier general in the Air Force, Ron Huldai, who's been the mayor of Tel Aviv, talk about democracy for 25 years. He actually made an explicit call for violence. He said dictatorships only become democracies when blood is spilled. He said that this morning. So you're getting the left is completely all in for this concept of inciting civil war, and it really is the heart of the matter, because you can't actually negotiate anything. You can't deliberate quietly between political leaders or societal leaders with a gun pointing at your head. That's not a deliberative process. That's not a negotiation. that's that's a hostage situation. And so we have the left in Israel that's literally gunning for a civil war and putting a gun to the head of Israeli society and saying, if you don't cancel everything that you're doing, if you don't break your word to your voters, in the case of the Likud and Shas and the Religious Zionism Party and the United Torah Judaism Party, all of them made explicit pledges to their voters that they were going to go through with significant judicial and legal reform in Israel to restore the checks and balances to our democratic system, and place limits on the power of the legal fraternity in this country. You can't have a deliberative process when one side is threatening civil war. And until these threats subside, until they stop using the Attorney General or the Supreme Court as a means to overturn the election results, we now have the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a petition, literally agreed to hear a petition with no legal basis, submitted by the U.S.-funded Movement for Quality Government in Israel, to oust Prime Minister Netanyahu from office. And Daphne Barak, the on-duty Supreme Court justice who received the petition, gave the government a month to explain why Netanyahu should be allowed to continue in office. I mean, this is crazy. The law on the books in Israel is that a prime minister is only removed from office for medical reasons. So there's no legal basis for the Supreme Court's action, and yet here they are. They've accepted a petition. So I mean, while all of this is going on, and the Attorney General is discussing, deliberating whether she should oust the prime minister. She has no legal power to do so. So we're not talking about people acting in a legal way. And, one of the things is that we see that, first of all, what we're seeing right now is that the protests are for dictatorship. They're protesting on behalf of tyranny. They're protesting for the continuation of this sort of behavior by Israel's Attorney General and Supreme Court, with no restraints by the elected officials in Israel. But today's guest on our show is attorney Roni Sossover, and she's working a lot on trying to push back against the woke indoctrination of our children in Israeli public schools. And what she's going to explain to us is how that's happening inside of the public schools in Israel, and what she and Avi Maoz, who's one of the most demonized men in Israel, maybe second to Prime Minister Netanyahu, what they're trying to accomplish. And I think what we see is not, they keep saying that if the Knesset restores checks and balances to our system and places limits on the power of the Supreme Court and of the Attorney General in Israel, that this is going to deny protection to our minority, so that what we're going to have is mob rule. It's going to be a tyranny of the majority against the minority. But what we're really seeing, we see it in the education system, we see it in the court system, we see it in the legal system, and we even see it in the defense ministry and in the IDF, that what you're increasingly seeing is a tyranny of the minority, a very small minority, in the case that I'm going to talk about with Roni Sossover, of activists who have infiltrated into the governing systems of Israel to impose their radical values and their radical objectives on an unwilling and extremely large majority of Israelis who never voted for their proposals, never accepted them, never agreed to them, and it's at the expense of the things that Israelis hold most dear. In the case of our legal system, it's the right of the people to choose their government, and for the governments and for our elected officials to advance and to implement the policies and the programs that they were elected on, that they were elected to accomplish. So, in the legal reform, it's that in the case of the education system, it's to cultivate and maintain and preserve and protect the Jewish identity of the state of Israel, of the children of Israel, and of the families of Israel, and to protect the sanctity of the family. And in the IDF, it's to protect the army from the indoctrination funded by foreign governments in many cases, to inculcate the conviction that there's something inherently wrong with Jewish statehood or with fighting to defeat your enemies as opposed to come to a draw or make peace with them or appease him. So, these are things that have gotten into our governing systems deliberately with malice aforethought by these very radical, very small minorities of Israelis that are working hand in glove with outside actors. And if we just want to go back to what's happening outside of the Knesset while I'm taping these remarks, it's been said and it's been shown that these demonstrations cost an enormous amount of money. One of the reasons, the Likud during the year and a half that we had the Bennett-Lapid government, one of the reasons why the Likud had so much trouble protesting against the government is because protests are really expensive, and you have to get all of the sound equipment, and you have to rent a thoroughfare, you have to rent stages, it costs tens of thousands of shekels at a minimum, and the larger the event, the more money you have to pay. And then the media would simply ignore the protests. You get 20,000, 25,000. I think my husband and I went to one of these protests that had several tens of thousands of people in Jerusalem, and it was covered almost nowhere. The media said nothing, and they tried to say that there were only a few thousand people there, and there were several tens of thousands of people at this particular rally that we went to. But they hide it. And on the other hand, the media is a full partner in organizing these demonstrations, of telling people where to go to get transportation, of course, publicizing them while they go on, on live TV, and photoshopping pictures of the crowds to make it look like even more people are participating than actually are. And so you have the media that's pushing this, and you have outside governments. In the case of what's happening now, and in the case of almost all of our left-wing protests, you have one particular organization, the New Israel Fund, that is directly involved in organizing these protests, organizing the groups that are all New Israel, in the main New Israel Fund organizations that are organizing these protests and then paying for them. So you have outside foreign organizations that are coming in and pushing these protests that are then, of course, being promoted by the Israeli media and by the opposition leaders in the Knesset and outside of the Knesset. And so it's not a level playing field. Why would the Likud be having these protests if nobody is going to cover them, and then they go through all this effort and the public doesn't even know that they took place? So, but we're seeing, again, this is a protest for tyranny, on behalf of silencing the votes of 2.4 million Israelis who voted for the government, who gave them 64 out of 120 seats in the Knesset to run the country, to govern the country. This is an effort to say that the votes of the minority, and we're not, again, I think I spoke about this in a previous show, this is not, a bare majority. It's not 68 seats to 64 seats to 56 seats. It's 46 seats that the left-wing parties have, another 10 seats that the Arabs have, and all of the Arab parties have made clear that both of the parties have made clear that they are not part of these protest movements. So you're talking about 46 mandates to the left, 64 mandates to the right. It's a huge disparity in numbers. And what they're saying, first of all, they're inciting their followers to believe the propaganda about what's happening, what the actual substance of the judicial reform package is. You have people like the mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Huldai, who are making explicit calls for violence, calls to arms of their followers against the government, against the ministers, against the leading members of Knesset, and against their voters. And it's being wrapped up and packaged and tied with a bow by the media in Israel that's presenting an incredibly and a completely false narrative to the people about what's actually happening on the ground and getting everybody frightened with them. So I give a lot of kudos to the president. And to be clear, Bougie Herzog, our president, is a man of the left. He's a former head of the Labor Party. He is not a right-winger. He did not vote for Netanyahu. I can assure you of that. And, if he has any political aspirations, he's only going to be able, for a post-presidential career, they can only actually transpire if, in fact, we see the left standing down and accepting the will of the voters. Because in the current atmosphere, no leftist is going to vote for him, right? Because they're being incited by their leaders against their fellow Israelis. They're being told that the voters on the right are less equal than they are, have less rights than they do, are inherently tyrannical and going to take away all of their rights, which is a complete lie, and transform Israel into, a Jewish version of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And one last note before I turn to my interview with Roni Sassover, and I show you, and she shows us how the tyranny of the minority is trying to take over the minds of Israeli children with funding from foreign governments. Before I turn it on, I just want to say one thing on that issue of Iran. Just as I was preparing this opening, I see that Nasser Kanani, the spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, related to what the left is doing and the chaos that they're trying to foment inside of Israel and domestic violence and strife that they're undertaking. What is the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman have to say about what's happening on the ground in Israel? He said, the regime in Israel is too weak to take military action against Iran. They need to focus on the chaotic riots in Israel that have been going on for 6 weeks. They won't take action against the Islamic Republic. So, this is having strategic implications abroad. This is having strategic implications on how our worst enemies
study prayers
view
or anything, but we
Israel
just studied the
and
Bible,
the power
so
of
we,
this
so we
country.
knew the
It's
stories
having
from the
strategic
Bible.
implications
We got
at home for how Israelis
we had a
view one
connection to
another
the Jewish
and how
people,
they view
to
what
our
democracy
ancestors.
actually
We
is.
knew where
And so when we're talking about beating back what's happening and restoring peace to our country, it can only happen. I'm terribly sorry. It can only happen if the left adopts the position of President Herzog, recognizes that there have to be limits to the legal system's power, and that the sovereign in Israel is the Knesset, which is the direct representative of the people of Israel, who went to the polls yet again on November 1st and elected our representatives to serve us and to advance our needs, among others, and first and foremost, actually, judicial and legal reform in this country. So that's what's happening here in Israel, and now we're going to turn to my interview with Roni Sassover about what's happening in Israel in the Israeli public schools at the hands of the comrades in arms for the people who are rioting outside of the Knesset today.